And good morning to all the Haven Home Safe staff who've dialed in or linked in for this or zoomed in, however it is, your whatever platform du jour you happen to be using. So this morning, my time is Monday evening time in Chicago, Illinois, in the United States of America, sometimes referred to as America's second city. That would be an erroneous label, of course, because we have with us today one of Chicago's most famous boosters, as they're referred to, someone who is not only proud, but proud to tell people about the fabulous things of their city. And that's Allison Clark from the MacArthur Foundation, who is a great friend of mine, and can I say, not just a booster of Chicago, but she'll take you and show you some of the fabulous places there as well. So for anyone who's a Frank Lloyd Wright fan, of course, Chicago is like it's the pinnacle to visit. It's a fabulous place, but there's so many great places about Chicago, and might get a chance to talk to Allison about some of that. But also, what we really want to do is talk about what's happening there as this worldwide pandemic affects us all, and if and how and maybe and when we make our way through that, and what that means for the sorts of organisations that we are, and certainly for our punters, as I like to refer to them. But I'd like to tell you first, before I formally kind of welcome Allison, a little bit about our guest speaker today. And Allison works as the Associate Director of Impact Investments for the MacArthur Foundation. The MacArthur Foundation is one of the largest philanthropic foundations in the world. There's been a bit of overtaking of philanthropic foundations with the tech foundations, if you like, of recent times, but they're really new kids on the block. And so some of these established foundations have systems, processes, reach and capacity that you really have to see to believe. Outstanding stuff. So Allison's worked in affordable housing and economic development, commercial real estate for over 20 years. Prior to joining the foundation, where she currently oversees a 150 million affordable rental housing preservation initiative, and I'll come to preservation in a moment. This is a word we don't use in affordable housing in Australia. But prior to that, she's worked as a senior underwriting manager in the community lending group for what's called Fannie Mae, which for all the Australians, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, just think of it as entities that underwrite loans that might not necessarily get invested in on the normal residential mortgage-backed security market. Before moving to Chicago, Allison worked participated in the Urban Fellows program in New York City, and she worked as a project manager at the New York Economic Development Corporation. That'd be really small, I imagine, like it's New York. How big could that be? It would be huge, right?
I've heard of it. It's some city over there on the East Coast.
Some tiny little city, yeah. So Allison's also served on the Attorney General's task force, charged with creating and implementing a program to deploy $100 million in grant funds from national mortgage settlements aimed at addressing the foreclosure crisis, which was a big thing back from 2008 onwards. She also serves on the board of directors of the Chicago Foundation for Women and the Chicago Chess Foundation. And I was pleased to be able to say that the 20th of July is International Chess Day. That's all I know pretty much about chess. I'm tapped out at this point. Okay, so Allison is a graduate of Harvard Radcliffe College with a bachelor's degree in government. She's also got a master's of management degree from the Kellogg Graduate School of Management. That's again, for the Australians, Kellogg is a really reputable university. Yes, it is related, I think, to the cereal manufacturer, but more as their endowment than the cereal box, just being clear about that. And I might also say that in that particular Masters of Management, that Allison focused on not-for-profit management and real estate. So, you know, the nexus between Allison's career and her skill set and what we do in the affordable housing and homelessness world is remarkably pointed and accurate, I'd have to say. Allison came into our orbit, and I met her through the International Housing Partnership, which many of you will know I chaired a while back. And the International Housing Partnership has benefited from the support of the MacArthur Foundation. As a result, that International Housing Partnership now is very solid and has arranged enormous amounts of cross-pollination of ideas and capacity building amongst the 4 country members. And so at this point, that's the welcome, that's the introduction. Allison, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. So good evening from Chicago, since it's now 6 o'clock in the evening. So I will be interrupted for dinner, and I will tell them to go away. But I will likely have at least one interruption since we're all working from home. So let me do a little just situating of Chicago and MacArthur Foundation. And Ken, you gave a great overview. So for those who aren't familiar with Chicago, we are the 3rd largest city in the United States. So New York City on the East Coast and Los Angeles on the West Coast are the 2 sort of big cities, and we're the central city in the United States in what's called the Midwest. We're the largest city. And so we have about 6 million people in the metro area, and the city itself proper is about 2 million. And we, now it's a money center city, originally was predominantly a location for agricultural. We're situated on Lake Michigan, which feeds into the Mississippi, so it was a very key sort of trade anchor for the development of the United States as we expanded from the East Coast out west. MacArthur Foundation, as Ken said, we are about the 10th largest foundation in the United States, which means we have a corpus. I don't dare ask my CFO or Chief Investment Officer what our corpus is worth today. As of about February 1st, it was worth about $6 billion, but I shudder to think what it might be worth now. But we were created about 40 years ago, and it was sort of an unusual creation because the founder who created us was a guy named John D. MacArthur, and he actually created the foundation and was very insistent that it be called the John D. and Catherine P. MacArthur Foundation. So we have a clunky name, but he was planting a flag for gender equality even then, which was quite unusual, and was very insistent on that. We were created without a specific mandate. So some foundations are created with a mandate to be focused on health or on children or whatnot. We were not. So our programmatic areas have evolved over time. And I work, as Ken said, in the impact investing area, and we could talk a little bit about impact investing in a second. But the area specifically that I was working on was on our housing portfolio, which we had a housing portfolio that started in 2000. We're actually coming to the end of that commitment. So we're in the process of actually exiting the housing work, although, and I can explain more about why that's happening. But I'm still staying involved with all the investments, and most of those will start paying off over the next couple of years. But as Ken said, it's been a wonderful opportunity for me to be at the foundation. I'm coming up on 14 years this fall that I've been here, and it really does let me bring, I think, the philanthropic power of impact investing to bear on the market forces related to housing in the United States. And really use our capital, what we sometimes call in the impact investing world, my funny money, to leverage resources from other traditional sources towards the good of affordable housing in ways that wouldn't necessarily happen but for our engagement. So let me pause there, and where do you want to take us, Ken? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
I am indeed on mute. I have my grandson who's being babysat here, and so he's a very, very active 15-month-old who's banging on my door. So I'll periodically go on mute.
If you need to go anytime, or we can always pause for a minute, so it's okay. We're all learning to adjust.
Indeed, and it's not biased, but he's very cute, obviously.
Very cute, exactly. So mine are teenagers, so they're not cute anymore. So they're less exciting when they come barging on my calls.
That's okay. I met them when they were much younger, and so they're still cute in my mind. And probably by the time I get back to Chicago, they'll be much older. They'll have come out the other side of those teenage years, and they'll just be fabulous, you know.
I think so. That's the goal. Yes.
Yeah. So the housing investment that MacArthur's made, just I guess on the subject of that, what are some of the learnings that you guys have picked up? I understand you've done a review of the impact of your impact investing. What's that told you?
So here's what I would say. So we went into the housing work 20 years ago, and the goal was twofold. One, we wanted to actually help preserve existing rental housing, and to your point, you wanted me to, I can sort of explain what we mean by that. Sometimes when people hear preservation, they think historic preservation, preserving buildings that have architectural significance or whatnot. That's not the type of preservation we're talking about here. In the United States, we use certain programs to build affordable housing that create a tax credit that is typically bought by a corporation. And in return for that credit against federal taxes, equity is invested in a housing project. And in return for that equity investment, the developer agrees to maintain those units as affordable for some period of time. But the question comes, and typically when the program was created, it was 15 years was the affordability period. But and it was wonderful, and it's been an enormous tool for creating affordable housing. The problem was that it created what we call the year 15 problem, which is that the organizations that own these properties in the year 15 then have to decide what they're going to do with the property. Are they going to keep it as affordable rental? Are they going to convert it to market rate rental? Are they going to potentially turn it into condominiums and therefore ownership opportunities? Or the other thing is, if the building has deteriorated enough, would somebody simply abandon it and say, you know, or run it as sub quality housing? So there was always this question of what happens after the end of that rent restricted period. And the tax credit program started in 1986. And so we started figuring out in the late 1990s that this was going to be a problem. And the question was, what were we going to start to do about it? So MacArthur became involved in this effort early on and tried to say, look, we as a country have invested a significant amount of money in these properties. Sometimes governments had actually provided grant support to the projects in addition to the equity support given through this tax credit. And sometimes they were located in areas that had gone through a substantial improvement, where now the neighborhood around it was quite nice, and there was therefore a lot of pressure put on those properties for an owner to sell and reap the profit. The question was, how can we preserve that housing? Meaning, how can we keep the housing safe and secure? How can we address deferred maintenance? In some cases, how can we invest in energy efficient, for example, upgrades, replacing windows and things? And how can we maintain the level of affordability so that people who are living in the property can continue to live there, or B, that the value of that unit remains as an affordable asset and part of that, what I like to call the affordable housing infrastructure within a community. Because what we had started to see was that buildings, when they flipped, when they became unaffordable, people who might have been living in the building for many years, who were as close to their job, their kids attended school or whatnot, not only were they potentially suffering a rental rate increase that could push them out, but very often the neighborhood around that property had become a higher cost area. Somebody couldn't afford to relocate within that community. So then therefore somebody had to move farther away, causing disruption to, again, access to jobs, children at school, et cetera. So the question was, could we help preservation-oriented developers, people that we like to think of as stewards as this asset, could we empower them to be able to acquire and preserve these properties by giving them access to the one thing that they don't have, but that the for-profit developers have, which is equity? So could we create a vehicle that was equity-like capital that could be given to nonprofits on a loan basis to let them compete with the for-profit developers, but be able to then acquire properties and rehabilitate them and put new financing in place and keep those units affordable? And could we do it by giving them the type of capital that they needed that the for-profit developers had access to and they didn't? So we made a handful of investments early on in 2000 with some developers to sort of test the concept. And we decided that this was actually something we really wanted to double down on. So we ultimately did a request for proposals, and we made a series of investments in nonprofit housing developers across the United States. Ultimately, there were 23 that we made across the United States in different markets. So some on the East Coast, some on the West Coast, in the Midwest, some in rural areas, some in more suburban areas. And the goal was to say, and when I say we invested in them, I mean that I gave, so Mercy Housing is a very large nonprofit developer based in Denver. We lent money to Mercy. So it's not property level debt. It was actually debt that we gave to Mercy. And then they were able to use that for pre-development expenses, for bridge financing, to put in a layer of debt that ultimately would have been paid for by some other public source, and gave them great flexibility in being able to do these transactions. So, and the type of financing was important, and I can explain a little bit about what the impact investing tool is that we use in the United States. But the important thing to understand for your listeners is that this was unsecured, 10-year, typically 1%. So this is really flexible in different type of capital, and it's the fact that it's flexible. It did have to be related to preservation transactions, so you couldn't have used it to buy your own office building or something like that. It had to be used for a programmatic purpose, but it meant that Mercy Housing didn't have to come to me every time and say, can I have $500,000? I want to buy this building in Lansing, Michigan. They could just do it. And the good news with that was, because they were typically using it for short-term basis, the developer, they could revolve this money in and out of deals pretty quickly. So most organizations didn't use the money for just one transaction, but were able to use it multiple times over the course of the 10 years. So this was pretty new, and nobody in the United States had done anything quite like this. Impact investing has been around for a while, and there were other examples of ways that foundations had done impact investing, but nobody had done anything quite like this with housing organizations, and certainly not at the scale of what we had done.
And I think I was just going to say, Alison, one of the things that kind of leaps out at us is that, in Australia, if we go back to, say, around about 2015, which is, not, it's kind of like yesterday in most people's terms, I think that the value of what we refer to as impact investing was measured in the tens of millions of dollars in Australia, and it's now measured in 2019 in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's been this meteoric rise, right? And so, but you guys have been doing it for a long time. So your tools for assessment and your understanding of what it is that you are going to get by virtue of your investment must be, I think, more sophisticated perhaps than where we are, and maybe we've ridden a bit on the back of that. But can you tell us about some of the tools that you use to understand both social impact and the investment piece?
Yeah. So to your point,
and we've just frozen at the moment. So we appear to have lost Allison for a little bit.
Originally it was 100,000 in units. Oh,
sorry, Allison, I was just going to say, can you just start that again? We just had a moment of screen freeze here.
That's it. We got it. So originally we had decided that we would invest this capital with the notion that the developers would preserve 100,000 units across the United States, and that was subsequently increased to 300,000 units when we did some follow-on investment. And so, candidly, at the beginning, we were very focused on what they would do with the money and what outputs they would get. So what the widgets, right, that if you think about it in business terms. And so we were tracking that quite carefully. But what we realized were two things. One, the punchline is we didn't get there. The housing organizations that we invested in, we didn't get to 300,000 units. And largely we didn't get into 300,000 units because there was a financial crisis that slowed a lot of preservation transactions down. And candidly, we probably overestimated what we thought that they were going to be able to do, because there still is, with all of these preservation transactions, you need to still have additional layers of subsidy beyond the tax credit and whatnot. And I don't think that we quite anticipated that there wasn't enough of that level of subsidy to do all the preservation deals we would have needed to be able to hit that 300,000. So we will, at the end of 2020, my guess is we'll be probably just shy of 200,000 units. So we weren't, we were off, but we still did an awful lot of things that we feel very good about.
Can I just say, Allison, from where we sit, if you talk about numbers of units, the moment you go past, I don't know, in Australian terms, 1,000, you've got some pretty focused attention going on. 200,000, unbelievable.
Right. Well, and then remember we have a population difference too. It's a little bit. I think the point was we were hoping that there was going to be some significant policy changes that were going to actually make doing preservation easier, and those didn't happen either. And they didn't happen because we had enormous political dysfunction after Obama was elected. And I should say, what the crazy thing is, when Obama was elected, and Obama, who I think I drove you past his house, Ken, but about 7 blocks that way is Obama's house. So he's our most famous neighbor in Chicago. he came in, there was tremendous hope that there was going to be alignment of interests, because he came out of a community organizing background. He cared intensely about people of color and of low-income communities, and his secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development was our grantee. For 7 of the 8 years he was in office, Sean, we call him Sean, he was the Secretary of HUD. And even so, we couldn't get it done. So there was enormous challenges. But I think what started to happen, we, in about 2016, I went to a housing conference that we had sponsored for many years called Strength Matters. And the point of Strength Matters, and this was something we had supported with grants, but most of the organizations that we had invested in were members of this effort. And the goal of Strength Matters is to say, how can the affordable housing field share best practices and do things across the industry that make these organizations look more like each other, so that they are, for lack of a better or more elegant word, more underwritable by traditional capital sources. Because the challenge had been that these organizations that had grown up, they came out of organizing backgrounds, they came out of churches, they came out of neighborhood level developments. So they all looked a little different. And some of them build new housing, some of them acquire new housing, some of them do home ownership, some of them do housing counseling. They do a lot of different things. So it means that as an outside investor, if you're trying to compare them, it's apples and pears. It's not organizations that are aligned. So Strength Matters was trying to get the industry to say, let's come up with some best practices. Let's come up with some ways to describe our business and to be able to quantify the risks that we're taking, such that an investment, a bank or a foundation can look and say, okay, here are two housing organizations. How do they compare against each other? So I was in a meeting of Strength Matters in 2016, and it happened to have been an anniversary year for that effort. And a longtime consultant of ours and a former borrower of ours had done a survey across the membership saying, okay, guys, here's 10 key financial metrics. Where are you now in 2016 versus 2006 when we launched this effort? Sort of tell us from the financial health standpoint of your organizations, how are you doing? And as Mary and Laura put up these slides, I looked and I realized that across the board, all of the members of this effort were seeing substantial improvements in their financial condition. And by things like this, I mean net asset ratios, months cash on hand, quick ratios. I mean, the wonky stuff that only those of us who are investors really groove on. Maybe your finance chair grooves on it. But most developers and foundation people don't, right? We like fuzzy feel-good stories. We don't want to know about net asset ratio. But what it made me realize is that the thing that we hadn't been capturing and trying to tell in the story was access to this capital that we had provided to these organizations. Not just what was it letting them do, but was it letting them do it and differently, and was it changing their organization as a result? And this is an outcome as opposed to an output. So we engaged with a consultant a couple of years ago and said, okay, we want to look across the organizations that we've invested in. Let's also look across some other peer organizations that we had not invested in. So we had some sense of comparison group. And let's say what happened. And we wanted to look both in terms of key financial indicators, but also in terms of things like leadership, their ability to hire new staff, their governance practices, how to change their relationship to their board, and be able to tell that kind of qualitative story as well as a quantitative story. And so the result, the report will be coming out probably in the next week or so. I just saw the final version that was laid out with all the pretty pictures on Friday. And the short answer is it did change the organizations. And we wanted to make sure we were telling the right story, because clearly the whole field got more sophisticated. But we did find that certainly organizations that had access to this level of capital, they certainly grew faster from a net asset standpoint. They grew from a month's cash on hand standpoint. And ultimately, by being able to grow their portfolios faster, they did become stronger organizations. They were able to achieve some economies of scale, and they certainly were had an easier time going into the room where it happens, to quote Hamilton, and get stuff done. You know, that they were able to get the public resources because they were just simply bigger. So, so that was an effort that we did, and we we wanted to tell that story because for those of us who are housers, it's an enormously important story to tell about why investing in housing is impact investing. Because sometimes when I talk about this, people think that housing is just units. And this, I think, gets us to the point where we can tell the story. Investing in housing organizations is about building up and sustaining that infrastructure to be resilient through crises and also responsive to situations like we have right now. But it also then we think is important for the impact investing field to be able to say it is, as much as we all want to invest and say how many kids got vaccinated, how many charter school seats got built, how many biodigesters are now operating. I mean, these are all metrics we love because they're close to our programmatic hearts.
Yep.
But that we also have to be able to say that creating strong organizations is equally important. We have to measure that too. We can't so fall in love with the product that we're not willing to say that we also equally think that the strength of the organization is an important measurement as well.
Yeah, so firstly, can you put us on the list for the distribution of the report when it comes out?
Absolutely, certainly will. It'll be on our website, but for sure I'll make sure you have it.
Thank you, and I'll send you a copy of a report on a very small program that we ran here that had despite us continuing to narrow the assumptions because we didn't quite believe the results, the most stunning return rate that we've ever seen on a social return on investment, but also a 100% success rate in working with homeless people, which is like, we still are stunned by that. So so we'll do that. The other thing is, I was just remembering when we had the International Housing Partnership meeting in Washington, and I'm struggling which year it might have been, but it was certainly during the Obama administration, and we wanted to make sure that everyone knew the Australians were in town, and so we had the
So you got into a bar fight? Oh no, that was in Chicago. There was a bar.
Chicago, that's a different one. We wanted to have the barbecue at the embassy, of course, and Jim Steele tells the story of everywhere you go in Washington, you line up through metal detectors and body searches, and if you look the wrong way, a body search turns into a cavity search, and none of us want to go there.
Yes.
And at the Australian embassy, we just rocked up off the bus, walked up to the security guard and went, "G'day, mate, we're the blokes from the housing conference." And they went, "Yeah, righto," and you go. And we're walking through, the alarms are going off, and you walk through and you get a can of beer put in your hand. But most of our American colleagues were stunned because in the crowd was not only Sean Donovan, who many knew before he became secretary, but he became a bit harder to get to when he became secretary of HUD.
Absolutely.
But all of his undersecretaries were there too, Carol Galante and I think it was Lisa and various others. But anyway, there you go. So it was a time of great hope, not just a campaign slogan, I think.
It was, and it's interesting because I think Nick Kristof, who not sure if you know who that is. He's an American journalist who writes for the New York Times, but he written several books. He wrote a long piece in the New York Times yesterday that I'm still thinking about, and he challenged his readers to find and articulate the moments of hope that this particular crisis and moment in time that we're in that it's presenting. And it is really hard to be finding moments of hope right now. And I know you're in a second lockdown. The mayor of Chicago just shut not bars that don't serve food. So if you're just purely a alcohol establishment, then you're closed now because, as we sometimes say, sometimes we prove why we can't have nice things because we don't follow rules, right? So. And you've seen what's happening across parts of the United States where I don't think we ever left our first wave, right? Where it just shifted.
Yep.
But one of the things that he was articulating is sort of look for the moments of hope. What has this moment let us see and articulate as a goal that we couldn't have potentially articulated before? And I think that for those of us in housing, as many people have figured out, if there is no shelter, you cannot shelter in place. And that sounds so crazy and fundamental, But I think now, to a certain degree, it took people seeing parking lots in Las Vegas with paint, on it to demarcate where people could be. People suddenly went, oh, now I get it. When it took, we had, and I don't know if they did this in Australia, but certainly here in Chicago and some other cities, the city said, okay, we have hotels that are empty. And so, hold on one second. I'm sorry, one second.
So while we've lost Allison,
I'm trying. No. I'm trying to get back. That was dinner coming and saying, and I was saying I was. But
you've got to tell me though, what's the look for the platypus?
Oh, I should have thought of that.
That's
So yeah,
fabulous.
you probably all have a platypus in your backyard, right? Yeah. So so this actually is one of those funny things. So years ago, when I joined the foundation, I was at a conference and I said to somebody, and I was talking on the panel about impact investing, and I said, being an impact investor at a foundation is like being a platypus in a pond full of ducks, right? We have webbed feet and a bill, right? We're swimming in the same waters, but we have venom and we sweat milk, right? That's our, and I hope you're impressed with how much I know about platypuses.
I'm amazed at your knowledge of monotremes.
Really, and so so this became sort of a joke, and other impact investors, we started calling ourselves Team Platypus, and so I actually got a little lapel pins made that I've given to people that we wear when we go to conferences, right? Like it's our secret message to each other. So we call ourselves Team Platypus, and we all have, it's inside, I won't go get it, but we all have little stuffed platypuses that live on our desk and whatnot. And so my colleague sent that card to me because she saw it and she said, well, how can I not send that to Allison? So
I love that. So I'm sorry I took you off topic there, but
no, I didn't. So all I was saying
fabulous.
Well, exactly. So the funniest part is that actually was quoted back to me once and I said, wait a minute. I said, that's my analogy. I said, I am a very emotionally generous person, but I want credit for the platypus. So what I was saying is that in Chicago, we had the tourism industry collapse. We had empty hotel rooms, and we had people who desperately needed shelter. So the city actually just blanketly leased a number of hotels and moved people who were gradually housed or in homeless shelters and moved them into hotels for a period of time. It's actually a good question, because now that I'm saying this, I actually don't know whether those folks are still there or if they've been able to transition out or not. But I think it gives us the opportunity to think differently about shelter, both its obvious importance, but also its limitations. Because one of the other things that's become very clear, and it's what we're all wrestling with right now as we think about schools and whether or not we can open schools in 6 weeks, is if home is now the site of education, what has to happen in order for that to happen? Because we have an enormous number of children who don't have access to internet at home. And I think people sort of understood that, but it took people realizing, wait, you want my child to go back to school because there are children in my child's school who otherwise can't do work at home. And I think it really forced a reckoning with some things like this that I think people hadn't quite, they might have known at some level, but this now is making it that much more powerful. So so there maybe are some opportunities for hope. I hope we just don't all forget it,
So I guess PJ's school would be closed as well.
So Chicago so everybody shut down in March. So basically from March through the end of the school year, everybody was at home, except that, PJ that Ken just mentioned is my husband, and he's actually a principal of a high school. So he did have to continue to go to school because, again, talking about things that come through that people don't realize, a lot of children in America get their lunch from schools.
Yep.
It's a program called free and reduced lunch, and many of them also get breakfast, and that had to continue even during the lockdown, because otherwise children just wouldn't have enough to eat, and particularly because parents were being laid off from jobs. So PJ or one of his staff people had to be at school every day, in addition to just doing some of the work that needed to be done to kind of keep the educational sort of work going. But he was handing out food every day to families that were coming. And so every day, and his school is actually in a relatively affluent neighborhood of Chicago. And even so, they were having 50 plus families come every day for essentially breakfast and lunch to be able to do that. So they shut. So now here we are facing the fall, and we have a hybrid model. I won't bore you with the details, but it means that younger kids will be in the school some days, not all days. And then by the time you get to juniors and seniors, so 11th and 12th grade, they're at this point 100% learning from home until a vaccine. I mean, I think it's a short.
Yeah, and I think very, very similar here that at schools, as we go into our second, what I refer to as lockdown light. So basically when you can't socialise,
yes.
Can't go out to eat and that sort of thing, but in essence, that's about it. But for those people who are homeschooling, it certainly adds an extra, can I call it, an extra dimension without beginning to pick the level of complexity in that people need to now add into this thing we call working from home, which, could be a topic for another day just on its own, and when I was talking to Michael Newey from the UK, we're talking about what will this mean for property, and it's like we could spend 5 days talking about sub-markets and where this will go. But in terms of I guess the MacArthur Foundation, and you guys are now moving into what you call some big bets.
Correct.
And I saw that on your website, and I just thought, so firstly, of course, the scale differential between America and Australia is, massive. It's what, 360, 380 million Americans, something like that, a little bit less at the moment.
Less 130,000 people. But
yeah,
yes.
Shocking, truly. We sit here stunned.
Mind-boggling.
Yeah, but the scale nonetheless is staggering. But from an Australian perspective, when not just in population but industry, and Josh, our IT guy who was setting up the Zoom, was saying that he'd seen on one of your emails a photo of the bay, and I said, Josh, that's not a bay. That's a lake.
It's a lake.
It's even your freshwater reserves are stunning. But anyway, the big bets thing, so the scale of the philanthropics there is massive. But what's the plan with the big bets? I mean, what is it that MacArthur's trying to achieve there?
So I'm glad you asked, because it's tricky. So and this gets to why we were leaving housing, which I mentioned. So we have at MacArthur, so $6 billion in net assets, 350 million roughly that we give away in grants each year. And when I joined the foundation, we had I can't even remember now how many programs, but we had a fair number. So let's say 12, maybe 14 programs. And programs at foundations, I say sometimes it's a little bit like a coral reef, because there's an accretion. You say, this is good, but maybe we should do this, and we should do this, and we should do this. And then next thing you know, you're trying to spread 350 million across this, and the board says, no, we can't, we're spreading ourselves too thin. We need to get back to this. So what that means is that, and this is not just true of MacArthur, but it's true of philanthropy in general, that every once in a while foundations go through this process of revisiting their programs. And sometimes it's tied to an evaluation and saying, are we just swimming upstream on an issue and we're not getting traction? Therefore, maybe philanthropy is not the right tool. Maybe it has to be political will or something like that to get it changed. Or are we, have we done enough that we feel like now we can bring other investors or other grant makers into that field, and we can go and take the level of resources we can provide and put it to something else? So there's multiple sort of factors there. And we went through a process like this a couple of years ago when a new president had come in, and the board had said, you guys are doing too much and you're spreading yourself too thin. And rather than having 14 programs with a $25 million budget, maybe we should shrink it and have, a fewer with more resources. And so we made some hard decisions, and they were really hard decisions. And one of them was housing. we spend, but we didn't cut it off right away. There was a long tail to it, but the goal was to say, if we can free up some resources by reducing some programs, then we can actually put more money to fewer things, and say, if we double or triple the amount of money we put towards a few things, can we move the needle faster and potentially in a more permanent way than we could if we just have little bits of it, working on it over time. So that's what we started to do. And so, I'm sorry, hold on one second. Sweetheart, I'm on the phone right now. Sorry. So that was the goal with the big bets, and to say, and then one of the big bets, which you may have found on our website, is we actually also invested in something called 100 and Change, which is that where we make over 3 different rounds, we're going to make $100 million grant to one effort, with the idea that can $100 million on one issue really change it in a fundamental way with that kind of massive infusion of capital. And so we did the first one last year, which was we made a $100 million investment in something called the Children's Television Workshop, which produces Sesame Street. And this is really designed to try to help children learn in refugee or in sort of fragile social situations. And can you essentially help children really, maintain that educational attainment and keep up with their peers in school. And so we are now in the process. I think we just announced I saw an email, but I haven't read it, that there's 6 finalists were announced today for the next $100 million, 100 and Change effort. So, then in addition to, so we have big bets, and we have big bets in climate, and we have big bets in, now you're going to test me, because now I'm going to have to try to remember all of them.
You don't have to remember all of them. I think we've got the gag.
but yeah, you could. But the idea is, and that, so, but in addition to those, which are big bets, and so criminal justice reform is one. There's a handful of them. In addition to that, there's also then what we call enduring commitments, and an enduring commitment is something where we say, look, journalism and media is just it's critical enough across all sectors that we're just going to support it, and that may change how we support it over time, but we're all in. We're not going to back away from that. So journalism and media is one, and Chicago is the other. We take a very strong we feel a very strong connection to our work in Chicago. It's our home city. Not every foundation does. So for example, Ford Foundation doesn't really see, they're based in New York, but they don't really see themselves as in New York. If anything, foundation, they think of themselves as still having a connection to Detroit. Exactly. Yeah. But the enduring commitments are a little bit different. So we in impact investing are part of the enduring commitments infrastructure as well, which means that there will always be impact investing, and we sometimes have our own time limited initiatives, and one of them is, we're actually a big bet with an initiative called the Catalytic Capital Consortium. But then we also offer continuing support across our grant-making peers to support the work that they're doing as well.
So I have to tell you, I was really pleased to hear that the Children's Television Network, in particular, received one of your big bets, because there's, believe it or not, a Bendigo connection to the Children's Television Network.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not. So the General
we like to
Counsel,
say, by the way, for your team, we like to say that Chicago's the Bendigo of the United States, right? That's, that's our...
Of course. It's self-evident. Please continue with that.
Wait, the Bendigo, you told me, was it silver, aluminum? What was the mining?
Gold.
It was gold. It was gold. Okay.
Yep, absolutely. Right. If we had time, I'd drag in a lump of quartz that I have that has a little reef of gold running through it. But
awesome.
no, so the General Counsel for the Voluntary General Counsel for Children's Television Workshop, who makes Sesame Street, is a guy called David Conliffe. David Conliffe is also the guy who has pushed for years for criminal justice reform in New York and was instrumental in closing Rikers and a whole bunch of these other prisons. So he's a fascinating man. But he was out here, and we had him as a guest speaker at a couple of events that we ran locally. And he came to Bendigo because his great-grandfather worked at the Bendigo Pottery. And we were able to show him where said great-grandfather was buried, the cemetery he was in, took him to the pottery, got a bit of a guided tour from the owners. So yeah, there's a tiny, a tenuous connection nonetheless. On the
I love
subject of tenuous connections,
So before I forget, though, I'm going to tell you one thing, because I always tell people when we talk about Sesame Street. So one of the most important things about Sesame Street, which gets lost, and I was the Sesame Street generation. I was born in 1970, and so I grew up watching it, and when it was really brand new and all of the changes that happened. There is a fabulous book called Street Gang that is a book about the organizing effort that went on behind Sesame Street. There was an enormous amount of community engagement and organizing that went into launching the show, that people don't appreciate. And for those of us who care about community and who care about making sure that you are responsive to community need, and that the efforts that we're doing are not top down, but that are really informed by needs that a community themselves has identified. Sesame Street is an amazing example of this. And it dovetailed right at the moment that there was this creation in the United States of the public broadcasting system. And so there was this sort of confluence of things, but it is for anyone who cares about community and children and equity issues, it is a fabulous book. So called Street Gang, and you can find it on Amazon, but it's a really wonderful book.
I'm so going to get that, because as I was saying, the tenuous link thing is really interesting, because Sesame Street and the Children's Television Network, and obviously Street Gang picks this up.
Yep.
You know, this is community activism.
Absolutely.
Finding a product that someone wants to pay for that generates a whole range of downstream benefits in communities, which goes back to sort of, you know, you were talking about the 10 financial metrics, you know, whether it's return on capital or net assets and all these things. And yes, they're important, and I don't kind of get quite as excited about it as my CFO, but I get very excited about the other metrics. You know, and in the US, some of these metrics are a bit different. It is affordable housing does contribute to levels of vaccination amongst children. Affordable housing does set up breakfast programs and helps to set up and creates in some cases enough volume so you can set up charter schools or support charter schools. And so, you know, children's education, which leads to a decrease in crime, which leads to an increased economic participation over a lifetime. All of these things are the metrics that can be claimed. I'm not going to say they're claimed easily, but they are able to be demonstrated, I think, in the American context a little bit easier than we can claim them here, because our built form is generally well, we don't have the volume. We don't do 600-800 apartment blocks. You know, we do 12 townhouses, 6 units on a block. And so we don't have the geographic impact in neighbourhoods. It's much more distributed. And so trying to get to the social metrics of what we do is much more granular. It's almost at household level. Have you seen anything around, you know, in your travels that sort of looks at that kind of granular level of social impact?
Absolutely. And in fact, some of the members, you know, you can I can give you some suggestions for other folks in the United States to talk to with some of your podcasts. There are some organizations that we have lent money to that are just light years ahead of anybody else in terms of what they track. So yes, it's some of the things that you talk about. It's educational outcome, it's health and various things, but it's also things like, are you registered to vote, right? What's your access to transportation to get places? Do you have access to fresh foods? You know, are you socially connected? So if you're seniors, do you have other connections so that you're not isolated from the community? And so there are some organizations. The Community Builders is one. That's Bart Mitchell they're based out of Boston, and they just do an extraordinary job of collecting really granular level detail. And another one is Preservation of Affordable Housing, also known as POA. What it's getting at, and POA has become very involved with something called the Family Independence Initiative, and what they're figuring out is that and I think many housing organizations in the United States are coming to this point. We've always known we can't build our way out of the crisis that we're in. We can't even preserve our way out of the crisis that we're in. So the question is, the other relief valve to the pressure would be that families who can improve their financial condition can move out and can exit this and be able to move into, and which has lots of benefits to it, beyond just the fact that they have choice of where they can move, and they have the flexibility to move for jobs or be closer to family or whatever neighborhood amenities they want. So POA has been working very closely on helping families create savings programs for their kids' education, as well as for their own ability just to build some net assets, so they potentially can have some savings that let them buy a car, that maybe lets them move, and some of these other various things. But I think that what you're describing is really critical, because it's not just being sheltered that changes your trajectory. It's what access to that shelter means, and that's not to minimize the pure benefit of shelter, but it's all those other things that let you do something different and engage in society in a different way.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things. I will say, one of the things that we did when we were engaged in our housing work early on was to do a lot of research about the benefits of housing. And the initiative was called How Housing Matters to Families and Communities. And there's a lot of that research is actually available. And I think if you Google How Housing Matters, you'll find it. It's now the research is living on the website of an organization called the Urban Institute. But a lot of it was getting just at this issue of what were the benefits to people from being stably housed that weren't obvious. And my favorite one is actually, there was an organization based in Boston called the Boston Children's Health Watch, I think is what it's called. And a pediatrician was trying to give advice to a parent of some young children, and she wanted the parents to give the kids more fresh vegetables. I think kids were probably having some health issues, whether it was weight or obesity or whatnot, and you need to give them more vegetables. And the mother simply said, I can't afford fresh vegetables. So the pediatrician said, well, this is effed up. So she said, how do I give a prescription for affordable housing to a family? So she basically said, look, we need to prove this, that people need to spend less on their rent so they can eat better. So they started doing some studies, and they found that when parents were able to move into housing where they weren't spending more than 30% of their income on housing, their kids started eating fresh vegetables. Who knew, right?
Yeah, right. Go figure, huh?
Right. And so this is, and I think one of those things that people sometimes take for granted, and they don't realize, no, there is a connection there. I hate it when I hear politicians, if they're talking about covering birth control or something, and they'll say, well, it's only $10 a month. What's the big deal? $10 a month.
For people, that's a lot. Yeah.
And so being able to sort of lift up some of those examples, I think, are really important.
So
with what's happening right now, I think we have the ability to capture and create a sense of urgency around some of those small costs.
Yeah, and thanks for the tips on that. So I don't know Bart Mitchell, but I do know Boston, and I'll track him down.
Yes.
And POA, I'm just trying to remember, I've met whoever it is who runs POA, but I can track them down through.
It's Aaron Gornstein is his name now. But super guy. So I'm happy to connect you to both of them.
That would be great. Thank you for that. And I'll certainly track down How Housing Matters. I'm reminded that some years ago when I was flying back from, I think it was Toronto or somewhere, and I had just a few hours stopover in Chicago, not long enough to come and visit, I'll have to say. But,
that's okay. That's all right.
But I was in the Admirals Club, which is kind of for the Australians,
Yep.
it's like the Qantas Club. And I was sitting there, and it was quite crowded. It was a Friday night or something, and struck up a conversation with a chap who was keen. He'd heard my accent. He was keen to talk about where in Australia are you from? What do you do? I told him what I did for a living, and he said, how does it feel to spend your life doing something that makes no difference to people? And I said, I'm interested to know how you could arrive at that. That's a somewhat challenging assumption. And he proceeded to tell me that he was a professor of economics at the Chicago School of Economics, which has not, can I say, covered itself in glory over the years.
No.
I usually refer to them as the lying, cheating bastards from the Chicago School of Economics, but leaving that aside. So we had, can I say, a very robust conversation about
I am
the impacts.
sure you did.
But anyway, he got up to go off to his flight. And then over the next 10 minutes or so, about 3 separate people came wandering past and stopped. And in that incredibly polite American way, said, "Oh, we weren't eavesdropping," words to the effect of, "We weren't eavesdropping, but we did hear your conversation." And all 3 of them said, "I would not be standing in this club here today before my flight if it wasn't for the affordable housing or the supported housing or the sheltered housing that I grew up in." And I thought, if only we could capture those stories as well.
Absolutely.
So, you know, there is no doubt that what we do is not only important and that it matters, but that it has effect. But Allison, we have to go. Our time here is up. I'd love to do this again sometime.
Absolutely. I'm going to leave you with one point, which is, and this is the thing. So Helen, my youngest, once said to me, "Mama, where do you feel most at home when you're not at home?" And she was about 5 or 6 when she asked me that, and it left me just gobsmacked. Because as somebody who thinks a lot about home and what does home mean, obviously home is shelter, but what she was really getting at was, where do you feel safe and secure and fully able to be who you are, that's not within your own physical place where you get your mail, right? Yep. And I think that the lesson I take from that is that all of us, everything that we do, it is obviously about creating shelter, but it is also about what does it mean to help people be whole and complete and safe, such that they can actually be their full authentic self and therefore be home in themselves. So I just wanted to share that because it's something that I think about and means so much to me as I think about the work you do. And I'm so grateful to be part of this community of, oh, look at you. You're so sweet.
Okay. I had to get a plug in, right? I think I've got your university cap over my other shoulder, but I had to get this one on at least once. You can see from the sweat stains, it actually gets a fair bit of wear. So
I love it. Well, you've just made, and you know that you've made my day. Thank you very, very much. So anyway, thank you for the invitation. I hope this was helpful. And be well and safe, everybody, to you and your staff. All right, take care. And
say hello say good day to PJ and the children for me too.
Will do. Wonderful. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.